The first thing my children heard that evening was not my voice on the phone calling to say I had landed safely. It was the solemn, authoritative cadence of a local news anchor announcing my full name across the television screen in their quiet living rooms. Authorities were reporting that 36-year-old retired structural engineer Evelyn Bennett had rushed directly into a catastrophic chain reaction collision outside the SeaTac airport terminal, pulling multiple trapped passengers from burning vehicles before first responders could fully secure the perimeter. At that exact moment, 20 miles away in suburban Seattle, my 38-year-old son, Julian, dropped his fork onto his dinner plate, while my 35-year-old daughter, Chloe, froze midway through helping her youngest child with a 5th-grade science project. Less than 2 hours earlier, both of them had sent identical, curt text messages advising me to take an Uber home because their personal schedules were simply too demanding to accommodate a trip to the airport. My name is Evelyn Bennett. I am 36 years old, a former structural engineer who retired early due to a severe spinal injury sustained on a bridge construction site 5 years ago, and I have spent the majority of my adult life avoiding the center of attention whenever possible. For nearly 14 years, my late husband, Thomas, handled our family's social calendar, managing holiday gatherings, soccer carpools, weekend barbecues, and neighborly dinners with an effortless, warm grace that held our world together. I was always happiest behind the scenes, analyzing blueprints, recalibrating structural stress calculations, repairing a leaky faucet in the basement, or quietly organizing tools in the garage on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Thomas used to tease me that I was the kind of person people leaned on because I carried heavy loads without making a sound, never realizing that my habitual silence would one day become the very wall that separated me from the children I loved so deeply. 3 days before the accident outside SeaTac Airport transformed my name into a national news headline, I stood completely alone beside a polished marble urn in a quiet chapel outside Vancouver, British Columbia. Thomas had spent the final 4 months of his life in Canada, undergoing an aggressive, experimental immunotherapy protocol after his stage 4 cancer had resisted every conventional treatment available in Washington state. His younger sister lived in Vancouver and had insisted on providing around-the-clock home care, allowing us to stretch our dwindling financial resources as far as humanly possible. I had traveled back and forth across the Canadian border as often as my physical therapy schedule allowed, each trip feeling heavier, each quiet goodbye at the border crossing lingering longer than the last. Then, on a gray, rainy Tuesday morning, there were no more goodbyes, only the profound, suffocating silence of an empty hospital room. Thomas had explicitly requested a private, minimal cremation ceremony with no expensive floral arrangements, no theatrical eulogies, and no formal gathering of distant relatives. More importantly, he had made me promise not to interrupt our children's lives during the final weeks of his illness. Julian was in the middle of closing a high-stakes software acquisition that represented the absolute pinnacle of his corporate career, while Chloe was navigating a brutal, emotionally draining custody battle following her divorce. Thomas knew that if our children learned how close he was to the end, they would drop everything and rush to Canada, jeopardizing the very stability he had spent 30 years trying to build for them. And so, respecting my husband's dying wish, I carried his diagnosis alone, standing silently in that Vancouver chapel as the director handed me a small, velvet-lined box containing Thomas's ashes. The following morning, I boarded a short commercial flight back to Seattle, carrying a single carry-on suitcase and holding Thomas's velvet box securely against my ribs, like a shield. My platinum wedding ring still rested heavily on my left ring finger. The skin beneath it felt tender and pale, and I could not imagine ever taking it off. Throughout the 45-minute flight, I stared out the oval window as dense, milky clouds drifted beneath the aircraft like fresh winter snowpack. Whenever we had flown together in the past, Thomas would instinctively reach across the armrest the moment the cabin shuddered from minor air turbulence, squeezing my fingers and whispering his favorite joke. "If we survive this descent, Evie, you owe me a bowl of clam chowder at the waterfront." I had always laughed, feigning annoyance at his predictable humor. Now, the empty leather seat beside me radiated a cold, hollow ache that no words could adequately capture. When the plane finally touched down at SeaTac a few minutes before 5 in the afternoon, the cabin filled with the rustle of unbuckled seatbelts and passengers rising to retrieve their luggage. I remained seated in 14B, feeling no urge to hurry because no one was waiting for me at the arrival gate. With trembling fingers, I opened our family group text, a thread that included Julian, Chloe, Julian's wife Karen, and a few close extended relatives who mostly shared birthday photos and holiday logistics. I typed a simple message. "My flight just landed at SeaTac. Is anyone available to give me a ride home?" I stared at the screen for a full minute before pressing send, my thumb hovering with hesitation, because asking for help had always felt like an admission of failure. The delivery notification marked the message as read almost instantly, but the silence that followed felt stretched thin and fragile. 2 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a response from Julian. "We're completely swamped with the quarterly audit tonight, Mom. Just take an Uber." Before I could even process his cold brevity, a second notification flashed across the screen from Chloe. "Mom, you really should have planned your travel better instead of expecting people to drop everything at rush hour." I sat in the dim light of the airplane cabin, staring at those words far longer than I should have. Planned better. As though grief could be scheduled neatly between corporate board meetings and after-school soccer drop-offs. As though bringing my husband's ashes home after losing the only man I had loved since I was 22 should have fit seamlessly into a shared digital calendar. My fingers hovered over the glass screen as a surge of protective instinct rose in my chest. I could have reminded them where I had been for the past 3 days. I could have typed out the painful truth that their father had been cremated less than 24 hours ago, that his ashes were currently sitting in a box on my lap, and that I was terrified of stepping into an empty house alone. I could have demanded the respect and comfort that any grieving mother deserved. Instead, remembering Thomas's quiet dignity and his desperate wish never to burden our children with guilt, I swallowed the lump in my throat and typed just 2 words. "No worries." I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket, not because everything was fine, but because I had suddenly realized a painful, fundamental truth about human nature. You cannot force the people you love to care about your pain if their eyes are turned entirely inward. Seattle greeted me outside the terminal with overcast skies, a biting northwest wind, and a steady drizzle that turned the concrete walkways slick and dark. Travelers hurried toward idling sedans, families embraced near the baggage carousel, and shuttle buses honked rhythmically against the evening traffic gridlock. My lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache, not merely from my old spinal injury, but from weeks of physical and emotional exhaustion. As I wheeled my small suitcase toward the rideshare pickup area, I noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift a heavy trunk off the curb. Without thinking, I stepped forward, offering a steady hand to help swing the baggage into her daughter's SUV. "Thank you so much, dear," the woman said, offering a warm, tired smile. "I hope someone shows you the same kindness when you need it." I smiled politely, whispering, "I hope so too," just as a deafening explosion shattered the evening air. Less than 50 yards away, A commercial fuel delivery truck jackknifed on the wet pavement after being T-boned by a speeding sports coupe, plowing directly into a row of stopped passenger vehicles. Metal crumpled with a sickening roar. Glass rained across the asphalt, and a towering wall of orange fire erupted into the gray sky. While the crowd around me froze in terror, some screaming, others pulling out smartphones to record the carnage, my structural engineering background and past emergency response training instantly overrode my fear. I dropped my suitcase onto the wet curb, ignored a bystander who tried to grab my coat, and ran straight toward the wall of flame. The acrid stench of burning diesel and melted rubber clung to my clothes and hair long after the chaos outside the SeaTac terminal had subsided into the rhythmic flashing of red and blue emergency lights. Because I had sustained minor second-degree friction burns across both palms and inhaled a significant amount of dense smoke while prying open the crumpled driver's side door of the burning sedan, emergency medical personnel refused to let me leave the scene on foot. Over my mild protests, they transported me in the back of an ambulance to the emergency department at Harborview Medical Center in downtown Seattle for mandatory observation and pulmonary evaluation. Sitting on the edge of a narrow, stainless steel examination gurney behind a thin beige privacy curtain, I held Thomas's velvet-lined wooden urn tightly against my lap with my freshly bandaged hands. When the triage nurse politely asked for the contact information of a family member or legal proxy who could pick me up upon discharge, I stared down at the white gauze wrapping my wrists, swallowed the lump in my throat, and whispered that I didn't have anyone available to call. The nurse offered a sympathetic, knowing nod, assuming I was a traveler stranded far from home, and quietly handed me a small plastic cup of water before drawing the curtain closed. In that sterile, fluorescent-lit cubicle, surrounded by the distant beeping of heart monitors and the muffled footfalls of busy hospital staff, I finally leaned my forehead against the cool wooden surface of Thomas's urn and wept in complete, suffocating silence, crying not for the harrowing danger I had just survived, but for the devastating realization that I was stepping into the second chapter of my life completely, utterly alone. 20 miles away in their respective suburban homes, my children remained entirely oblivious to my presence in the Harborview emergency room, but their quiet evening was about to be shattered by the unstoppable momentum of modern broadcasting. Julian was sitting at his granite kitchen island, his laptop open beside a half-eaten plate of grilled chicken as he reviewed final financial spreadsheets for his company's acquisition, while Chloe was clearing dishes in her dining room while mentally cataloging her packed schedule for the upcoming work week. On the living room television screens in both houses, a special breaking news bulletin interrupted the local evening programming. The broadcast opened with dramatic, high-definition footage captured by an overhead news helicopter, showing thick black smoke billowing into the twilight sky above the SeaTac airport exit lanes. But as the news anchor began detailing the initial reports of the multi-vehicle disaster, the camera feed shifted to a high-resolution video clip recorded from the dash cam of a commercial shuttle van that had been parked near the rideshare pickup curb just seconds before the collision occurred. The video clearly captured a 36-year-old woman in a dark rain jacket pulling a small wheeled suitcase, her face illuminated by the bright screen of her smartphone. The footage showed her staring at her phone screen for several long, agonizing seconds after receiving a message, a subtle look of profound, heart-wrenching disappointment passing across her features, before she slowly typed a brief reply, slipped the device into her pocket, and began pulling her bag through the cold drizzle with her head bowed. The news producer paused the dashcam video on a clear, high-definition freeze frame of the woman's face, before transitioning to ground-level video recorded by a bystander just moments later, showing that same woman dropping her suitcase on the curb and running directly into the roaring wall of fire to smash open the window of a trapped sedan. Across Seattle, Julian and Chloe froze in absolute paralyzing shock as their mother's name was read aloud by the news anchor. In Julian's house, his wife, Karen, gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting from the television screen to her husband's pale, rigid face. With trembling hands, Julian pulled his smartphone from his pocket and opened our family group text, scrolling back to the short exchange that had occurred less than 2 hours earlier. He stared at his own cold words. "We're completely swamped with the quarterly audit tonight, Mom. Just take an Uber," followed immediately by Chloe's harsh reprimand. "Mom, you really should have planned your travel better instead of expecting people to drop everything at rush hour." Across town, Chloe fell onto her sofa, tears bursting from her eyes as she stared at the screenshot of the airport timeline that local reporters had already reconstructed from public security feeds. The news anchor went on to explain that Evelyn Bennett had just landed on a flight from Canada, where she had been attending the final arrangements for her husband. The sudden, agonizing realization hit both of my children like a physical blow. Their mother had been standing alone in a rain-slicked airport parking lot, carrying their father's ashes, when they had dismissed her grief as an inconvenient disruption to their busy lives. By 8 o'clock the following morning, my cell phone was resting face down on a small wooden side table in the quiet Harborview waiting room, vibrating continuously with dozens of frantic missed calls and unread text messages from Julian, Chloe, and several extended family members who had seen the morning news broadcasts. I sat quietly near the window, staring out at the gray morning mist rising over Elliott Bay, feeling no desire to pick up the device. I did not remain silent out of a desire for petty revenge, nor did I want my children to writhe in public guilt. I simply felt so hollowed out by grief that I had no emotional energy left to manage their sudden, panic-driven repentance. Shortly after 9, a young woman wearing a sharp navy blazer and holding a small notepad stepped quietly into the waiting room. It was Emily Harper, the veteran field reporter for King 5 News who had covered the accident the previous night. She approached me with a gentle, respectful hesitation, explaining that she had tracked me to Harborview through hospital public relations after learning that the medical staff had treated my burns. "Mrs. Bennett, I promise I'm not here to shove a microphone in your face or turn your pain into a sensationalized spectacle," Emily said softly, taking a seat 2 chairs away from me. She went on to share that her own father had passed away suddenly 3 years prior while she was covering an out-of-state story, leaving her with an enduring, heavy regret over the conversations they had never managed to finish. Her quiet, authentic empathy dissolved my defensive barriers, and when she asked if I would consent to a single, dignified interview to clarify why I had been at the airport alone, I agreed under one strict condition. She would not allow the broadcast to attack or humiliate my children. An hour later, after the hospital physician officially cleared me for discharge and rebandaged my hands with clean white dressings, I declined the hospital staff's offer to arrange a medical transport van. Instead, I took a quiet 20-minute taxi ride back to the long-term parking garage at SeaTac Airport, where my 12-year-old dark blue Ford pickup truck had been parked since I had driven it to the airport 4 days earlier, before flying to Vancouver. The weathered truck, the very vehicle Julian and Chloe had often teased me for keeping long past its prime, started with a familiar, deep rumble as I turned the ignition key with my wrapped fingers. I carefully placed Thomas's velvet urn on the passenger seat beside me, securing it with the shoulder seatbelt, just as I had done for 14 years whenever we drove through the mountains together. Driving back toward our suburban home in Westerville along the wet asphalt of Interstate 5, I felt a strange, quiet calm settling over my chest. I knew that the news story was currently spreading across the Pacific Northwest, and I knew that my children were likely standing on my front porch at that very moment, consumed by fear and regret. But as I held the steering wheel with my bandaged hands, looking at the familiar gray skyline of Seattle through the rain-streaked windshield, I realized that my journey home was no longer about escaping the past or proving my worth to anyone. It was about stepping courageously into the quiet sanctuary of the truth I was ready to build. At 7 o'clock that morning, while I was still receiving my final medical evaluation at Harborview, Julian and Chloe met outside the front porch of our family home in Westerville. The house, a sturdy, 2-story craftsman structure with dark wood siding and a wide front porch that Thomas and I had spent 15 years renovating, stood quiet under the overcast sky. Julian unlocked the front door, using the brass emergency key I had hidden beneath a terracotta planter on the porch years ago. As the door swung open, the interior greeted them with an eerie, motionless stillness. Everything inside appeared exactly as it had when Thomas and I had departed for Canada weeks earlier. Thomas's favorite leather armchair sat facing the large bay window overlooking the overgrown front garden. My old steel-toed work boots rested neatly on the rubber mat beside the coat rack. And the familiar, comforting aroma of freshly ground hazelnut coffee was entirely absent, replaced by the faint, dry scent of settled dust. Chloe walked slowly into the dining room, her hand resting against the edge of the dark oak dining table, where our family had shared countless Thanksgiving dinners. In the center of the table sat a small ceramic vase containing a bundle of dried lavender stems, their faded purple petals brittle and still. Chloe touched one of the dried blossoms, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, "He kept them." Julian looked over from the hallway, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Kept what?" "The lavender," Chloe replied, her voice breaking softly. "Dad always bought fresh lavender from the Pike Place market every single year for Mom's birthday. These were from her 35th. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke, the heavy silence inside the empty house carrying a weight far more intense than any spoken reprimand. Attempting to channel their nervous energy into something productive before I returned, Chloe began dusting the bookshelves in the living room, while Julian organized the scattered mail resting on the entryway console. While wiping down the lower shelves of a heavy pine cabinet beneath the staircase, Chloe's hand brushed against a small brass latch on a dark cedar chest that had sat tucked away in the corner for as long as she could remember. The chest, crafted from solid, aromatic cedar, had belonged to Thomas's family for 3 generations. "Julian, come here," Chloe called softly, kneeling on the rug beside the chest. "I don't think I've ever seen this unlocked." Julian walked over, leaning against the doorframe. That was Dad's private trunk. He kept old tax records and deed documents in there. The brass latch gave way with a soft click as Chloe lifted the heavy cedar lid. Inside, resting atop neatly folded wool blankets and faded blue ribbon certificates from our college days, were 6 thick, leather-bound journals. Each journal bore a 4-digit year stamped in gold foil across the spine, spanning from the year Julian was born to the present day. Chloe picked up the most recent volume, her fingers tracing the worn leather edge. "Maybe we shouldn't read these," Julian hesitated, stepping back slightly. Dad was extremely private about his personal thoughts. "Julian," Chloe said, looking up with tears glistening in her eyes. "He carried Mom's ashes home on a plane yesterday, while we told him we were too busy to pick him up. I need to understand who our parents actually were." Slowly, with trembling hands, Chloe opened the leather cover to the first page. The initial entries contained ordinary, endearing records of domestic life, detailed notes on garden soil acidity, lists of home renovation expenses, descriptions of weekend camping trips in the Cascade Mountains, and gentle observations about Julian and Chloe's childhood milestones. But as Chloe turned the pages into the volumes covering the past decade, the tone of Thomas's handwriting shifted, revealing a silent, jaw-dropping chronicle of sacrificial love that neither of my children had ever suspected. One entry, written 8 years prior, stopped both of them completely cold. June 14th. Sold the fishing boat today, Thomas had written in his precise, neat hand. Evie begged me not to tell Julian why. We used every single dollar from the sale to cover the closing costs and down payment on Julian's first townhouse in Bellevue. Julian believes the bank approved his loan based on his software salary alone. Evie smiled as we signed the wire transfer, telling me that a mother's greatest joy is building a floor beneath her child's feet without letting them see the timber. Julian stared at the handwritten words, his face draining of all color as he fell heavily to his knees beside the open chest. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming disbelief. I thought Dad sold that boat because he was getting too old to haul it to the lake." Chloe turned another page, her eyes scanning an entry from 5 years ago. October 22nd. Withdrew the remaining equity from our home improvement account to pay the retainer for Chloe's divorce attorney today. Evie sat with her in the kitchen for 4 hours last night while Chloe cried about her legal fees. Afterward, Evie told the children that we were thinking about downsizing our home anyway so they wouldn't feel guilty about accepting the financial help. Sometimes love sounds like a casual joke told to hide a devastating sacrifice. Page after page, year after year, the journals unraveled a decades-long tapestry of silent, unacknowledged devotion. Every major life milestone my children had celebrated as personal achievements had been quietly fortified by sacrifices Thomas and I had made behind closed doors. When Julian's first tech startup nearly failed during its second year, Thomas had quietly taken on evening consulting work at age 60 to cover their payroll shortfall without telling Julian. When Chloe's daughter needed specialized orthodontic care and speech therapy, I had postponed my own spinal fusion surgery for 18 months so our family insurance policy could cover the pediatric specialists. Never once had Thomas or I mentioned these sacrifices to our children. Never once had we asked to be repaid or acknowledged. Then Chloe reached a page written just 4 months ago, during the week Thomas received his terminal diagnosis in Seattle. Chloe read the passage aloud, her voice trembling violently through her tears. "The specialists at Harborview informed us today that conventional options have ended. Evie immediately researched an experimental trial in Vancouver and insisted we try, withdrawing almost everything remaining in our retirement portfolio to cover the out-of-pocket medical expenses." She smiled while signing the hospital paperwork in the hallway. But I know exactly what it cost her physical health and peace of mind. If I do not survive this treatment, I pray our children never mistake Evie's quietness for indifference. Beneath her silent exterior is the fiercest, most unselfish heart I have ever known in my life. Julian leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the hardwood floor as heavy, racking sobs shook his shoulders. "I told her to take an Uber," he choked out, his voice suffocated by grief. "She was bringing Dad's ashes home, and I told her I was too busy with an audit." At 9 o'clock, Julian's wife, Karen, arrived at the house, carrying a box of fresh pastries and coffee, sensing the profound distress in her husband's earlier phone calls. She walked into the living room to find Julian and Chloe sitting side by side on the floor, amidst the open journals, their faces pale and eyes red from crying. Without a word, Chloe handed Karen the volume, open to Thomas's entry about the Vancouver trial. Karen read the page in complete silence, her eyes filling with tears as she gently closed the leather cover and placed her hand on her husband's trembling shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Julian," Karen whispered softly. "We were all so focused on our own busy lives that we never stopped to look at what your parents were carrying." Julian looked up at his wife, his eyes hollow with remorse. I don't even know how to look her in the eye, Karen. How do you ask for forgiveness from a mother who spent 30 years quietly giving up everything for you, only to be told she's an inconvenience? Before Karen could answer, the low, familiar rumble of my 12-year-old dark blue Ford pickup truck echoed down the quiet driveway outside. The children froze as the engine shut off, followed by the heavy clunk of the driver's side door closing. Across the quiet living room, Julian, Chloe, and Karen stood up slowly, looking toward the front entryway as my footsteps approached the porch, ready to face the woman whose silence had finally exposed the depth of their own neglect. The interview with Emily Harper aired across the Pacific Northwest at noon that same day, preceding my arrival home by mere hours. Sitting in the quiet conference room at Harborview Medical Center before the cameras began rolling, Emily had looked at me with deep professional respect and asked if I was ready. When the red recording light illuminated, her opening question was one that millions of viewers were asking. "Mrs. Bennett, you rushed into a wall of flame while others hesitated. People are calling you a hero. Where did that courage come from?" I looked down at my white bandaged hands, feeling the weight of Thomas's velvet urn resting in my lap, just out of the frame. "I don't feel like a hero," I answered softly, my voice steady despite the emotion tightening my throat. "The firefighters and paramedics who do this every single day, they are the brave ones. I simply saw people who were in desperate need of help. And when you have spent 4 years watching someone you love fight for every breath, fear stops mattering as much. You stop asking whether a situation is dangerous, and you start asking whether someone needs you." Emily nodded slowly, allowing the quiet weight of my words to breathe before gently asking the question that had sparked wild speculation across social media. "Your family was not at the airport to meet you after such a long and painful journey. Are you angry with them?" That was the precise moment when I could have unleashed a torrent of public humiliation upon my children. I could have revealed the cold text messages, described the lonely flight from Vancouver, and allowed millions of strangers on the internet to condemn Julian and Chloe for abandoning their grieving mother. But as I looked into the camera lens, I saw the faces of the children I had raised, and I remembered Thomas's gentle voice, reminding me that public humiliation never heals a private wound. I offered a faint, compassionate smile and replied, "My children have incredibly busy lives. They are raising families of their own, navigating demanding careers, and carrying more daily pressure than my generation ever faced at their age. Life gets complicated, and timing doesn't always align. I have had enough sadness in my life this week. There is no reason to add anger to it." That single sentence, "they have busy lives," rippled across the country within hours. It was shared by hundreds of thousands of people, sparking emotional conversations in comment sections nationwide. Viewers recognized the profound, unselfish grace in my answer, with many confessing that my words felt like a quiet, penetrating mirror reflecting their own neglect of aging parents. People posted about booking sudden flights home, calling estranged family members, and realizing that the greatest gift a child can offer a parent is not material success, but the simple, unprompted gift of their time. When I finally pulled my dark blue Ford pickup truck into the driveway of our Westerville home shortly after 10 o'clock that morning, the rain had tapered off into a quiet mist. Stepping out of the cab with Thomas's urn tucked under my arm, I walked up the front steps and stopped at the threshold. Sitting on the wooden porch benches were Julian and Chloe. Neither of them was holding a phone. Neither of them was checking a watch or looking at a schedule. They were simply sitting in silence, waiting for me. For several long seconds, none of us moved.
The porch light cast soft, elongated shadows across the damp wood, making my grown children look surprisingly young and vulnerable. Parents spend the better part of 30 years teaching their children how to be independent, how to drive, how to manage finances, how to build careers and stand on their own 2 feet. But the hardest, most delicate lesson a parent ever teaches is showing their adult children how to walk back when they have lost their way. Julian stood up first, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a raw, agonizing remorse that no words could articulate. He took 3 slow steps toward me, his gaze dropping to my bandaged hands before meeting my eyes. "Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking entirely. "Let me take your bag." For a brief second, my old habit of self-reliance almost made me say no, but I recognized that allowing him to carry my load was the first step in his healing. I handed him my suitcase handle, and he carried it inside as though it were made of delicate glass. Chloe stepped forward next, her arms wrapping gently around my waist as she buried her face against my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. "I made coffee, Mom," she whispered through her tears, her voice muffled against my jacket. I smiled faintly, stroking her hair with my bandage-wrapped fingers. "Is it your father's hazelnut recipe?" She nodded, looking up with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I tried, but it doesn't taste like his." "It never will," I replied softly, offering a genuine, warm smile, my first since Thomas had passed away. And that's okay. We walked inside together, where the house felt warm and surprisingly alive. On the dining table, beside the vase of dried lavender, Julian and Chloe had placed the 6 leather-bound journals from the cedar chest. Julian stood by the table, his shoulders trembling as he looked at me. "We read Dad's journals, Mom," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We saw everything. The boat, the divorce fees, the house equity, the Vancouver trial. All of it." "Why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think you were just being quiet and frugal?" I walked over to the table and gently rested my bandaged palm over the leather cover of the newest journal. "Because helping you was never supposed to become a debt for you to carry," I said quietly, looking from Julian to Chloe. "Your father and I didn't make those sacrifices so you would owe us gratitude. We made them so you could build stable, happy lives without the weight of financial fear." Chloe reached out, taking my other hand in hers. "I wrote that you should have planned your travel better, Mom," she wept, her voice filled with crushing guilt. "I actually typed those words to you while you were holding Dad's ashes." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You cannot erase what you wrote, Chloe, but you can decide who you choose to be from this day forward." Julian looked at me with deep reverence, asking softly, "When Emily Harper asked why we weren't at the airport, you could have destroyed our reputations on national television. Why did you protect us?" I looked at Thomas's urn resting on the sideboard, feeling his enduring presence in the quiet room. "Because public humiliation doesn't heal private wounds," I answered firmly. "If millions of strangers hated you today, it wouldn't bring your father back, and it certainly wouldn't bring our family together. Speaking in anger only creates another mess you have to clean up tomorrow." 3 days after my return home, on a crisp, sunlit autumn morning, our family drove together to the rocky shores of Puget Sound, just north of Edmonds. The coastal air was cold and fresh, smelling of salt water and pine, with pale golden sunlight breaking through the high cirrus clouds above. Standing together at the edge of a driftwood-scattered beach overlooking the deep blue waters of the Sound, Julian, Chloe, and I gently opened Thomas's velvet-lined urn. As the quiet tide lapped against the smooth gray pebbles, we scattered his ashes into the gentle sea breeze, watching the fine silver dust drift out across the sunlit water toward the snow-capped peaks of the Olympic Mountains. It was the exact spot where Thomas and I had taken our very first weekend trip as 22-year-old newlyweds, and where he had asked to return when his journey ended. There were no dramatic speeches, no performative displays of grief, only the steady, comforting presence of my children standing beside me, their arms wrapped securely around my shoulders as the cool wind swept across our faces. For the first time since Thomas's passing in Vancouver, I did not feel the suffocating weight of solitary abandonment. Standing on that shore, surrounded by the family he had spent his lifetime building, I knew that Thomas was finally, completely at peace. In the weeks that followed the memorial at Puget Sound, the true nature of my children's redemption began to reveal itself, not through dramatic, one-time declarations of remorse, but through the quiet, consistent commitment of showing up every single day. Realizing that a single apology could never undo months of unintentional neglect, Julian reorganized his demanding corporate routine. Without making a grand announcement or seeking praise, he canceled his non-essential early morning meetings every single Wednesday and began driving to my Westerville home at 7:30 in the morning, carrying 2 large paper cups of hot hazelnut coffee from a local bakery. We would sit together on the front porch in the quiet morning air, watching the autumn leaves fall across the lawn while talking about his children's school progress, my ongoing physical therapy, or simple neighborhood updates. When I gently reminded him during his 3rd visit that he didn't need to drive 20 miles just to bring me coffee, Julian looked at me with a soft, earnest smile and said, "When we were kids, Mom, you gave us your time because we needed it. Now that I'm an adult, giving you my time is a choice I want to make every week." That simple sentence meant more to my healing heart than any expensive gift he could have purchased. Chloe transformed her routine as well, establishing a sacred family tradition every Thursday evening. She would arrive at my house straight from work, carrying bags of fresh groceries, and together we would prepare dinner in the kitchen. She brought her 2 daughters along, allowing the house to fill once again with the vibrant, messy energy of young children doing homework at the dining room table while the radio played softly in the background. Chloe tried repeatedly to recreate her father's chicken noodle soup, laughing at her own failed attempts when the broth lacked his signature rich flavor. "I followed Dad's written recipe word for word, Mom," Chloe confessed one evening, setting down her spoon with a humorous sigh. "Why does yours and Dad's always taste so much better?" I smiled, reaching over to wipe a spot of flour from her cheek with a napkin. "Because your father always added one secret ingredient that isn't written in any cookbook, Chloe." She looked up, curious. "What ingredient?" "Patience," I replied softly. "He never rushed the broth, and he never rushed people." Chloe laughed, a warm, genuine sound that echoed through the kitchen, and for the first time in years, the shadow of her painful divorce seemed to lift entirely from her shoulders. The grandchildren noticed the profound shift in our home before anyone else. On a crisp Saturday afternoon in late October, Julian's 10-year-old son, Ethan, wandered into my garage while I was organizing my old woodworking tools on the workbench. He looked around at the shelves lined with hand saws, spirit levels, and neatly labeled jars of brass screws, his eyes filled with quiet fascination. "Dad says you used to be a structural engineer, Grandma," Ethan said, running his fingers along the smooth wooden handle of a handplane. "He says you helped build real bridges across the river." "I did, Ethan," I smiled, pulling up a wooden stool for him. "Engineering is just the art of making sure heavy things don't fall down." Ethan looked up at me with earnest blue eyes. "Can you teach me how to build something?"
those simple words filled a hollow space in my chest that I hadn't realized was still empty. For the next 3 hours, Ethan and I worked side by side in the garage, measuring cedar boards, sanding rough edges, and carefully driving nails to construct a simple wooden birdhouse. When we finished, the little birdhouse leaned slightly to the left, its roof panel slightly crooked. "It's not perfect, Grandma," Ethan said, looking a bit disappointed. I placed my bandaged hand gently on his small shoulder. "Neither are families, Ethan. But as long as the foundation is strong and square, it will stand through any storm." Our healing journey was also enriched by an unexpected, enduring friendship with Emily Harper. The veteran journalist did not disappear after her news broadcast aired. Instead, she stopped by my house 2 weeks later to deliver a framed photograph a bystander had taken at the airport. A quiet, beautiful image of the rainbow that had formed over the Puget Sound sky just as the rain stopped that fateful evening. Emily became a frequent weekend visitor, sitting on our back porch with me and my mother, Margaret, who had moved in temporarily to assist with my physical recovery following her own successful hip surgery. Emily shared stories of her late father, while my mother entertained us with humorous tales of my childhood engineering experiments, like the time I tried to construct a functional miniature elevator inside her hall closet using pulley ropes and milk crates. Watching my mother laugh heartily with Emily and my daughters in the garden, I realized that setting firm boundaries against past neglect had not isolated me from the world. It had simply cleared away the noise, creating a safe, sacred space where genuine love, deep mutual respect, and lasting healing could finally flourish. On a warm, sunlit Saturday afternoon in early October, our suburban backyard in Westerville filled with folding lawn chairs, colorful paper lanterns hanging from the maple trees, and more genuine family warmth than I had ever known in my youth. We were gathering to celebrate what would have been Thomas's 66th birthday, a milestone that once felt like it would be shrouded in unbearable grief, but instead had transformed into a joyful tribute to his legacy. My mother, Margaret, was supervising the barbecue setup from her lawn chair like a seasoned general, her bright purple rolling walker parked safely beside her as Julian grilled hamburgers nearby. Neighbors, close friends, and colleagues from work wandered through the grass, carrying paper plates and admiring my 3 grandchildren who were chasing a golden retriever puppy across the lawn with shrieks of pure delight. Looking out over the yard, I felt an overwhelming wave of quiet fulfillment wash over me, knowing that every single person present was there out of unconditional love, completely unburdened by social posturing or the need to prove anything to the world. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the tree line, casting a golden amber glow across the yard, Julian stood up from the picnic table and gently tapped his glass with a fork to gather everyone's attention. The chatter around the lawn quieted down as he looked around at his wife, his children, his sister, and finally met my eyes. "I'd like to say a few words about my father and about my mother," Julian began, his voice thick with emotion. He took a deep, steadying breath, his hands trembling slightly as he held a handwritten note. "For years, I believed that success meant providing material security for my own immediate family. I was so focused on climbing corporate ladders that I forgot my family also included the 2 people who spent their entire lives quietly building the foundation beneath my feet." Julian looked directly at me, tears glistening in his eyes. "I can never erase the cold text message I sent you at the airport, Mom. But I promise you today, before everyone here, that for as long as I live, you will never have to wonder again if someone is coming to pick you up." Chloe reached across the table, taking my hand tightly in hers, whispering, "Neither will I."
Later that evening, after our guests had departed and the grandchildren were tucked into sleeping bags in the living room for a weekend sleepover, I walked into the quiet, dimly lit kitchen to begin cleaning up. Opening the clutter drawer beside the refrigerator to search for a pair of scissors, my fingers brushed against a cream-colored envelope that I had tucked away weeks ago and completely forgotten about. An invitation to a corporate gala that Julian's former business associates had sent us months prior. I pulled it out and looked at it under the warm overhead light, feeling a soft, peaceful smile touch my lips. There was no lingering bitterness, no ironic triumph, and no residual anger left inside my heart. My happiness had never depended on witnessing anyone's downfall, nor on receiving public praise for surviving a tragedy. True happiness was standing right here, in my own sunlit kitchen, listening to the dishwasher hum softly and hearing Julian and Chloe in the adjoining room softly debating over whether leftover birthday cake counted as a legitimate Sunday breakfast. Without a moment's hesitation or emotional weight, I dropped the envelope straight into the recycling bin, closing the drawer firmly behind it. Before going to bed, I walked down the carpeted hallway and stood quietly in the doorway of the guest bedroom, where my daughters and grandchildren were sleeping. Bathed in the soft, amber glow of the nightlight were 3 quiet beds, soft blankets, and steady, rhythmic breaths echoing through the peaceful room. Watching them sleep, I realized that the hardest season of my life, the cold concrete of the airport, the burning vehicles, the lonely hospital cubicle, had not been a tragic detour or an unfair punishment. It had been the necessary crucible that stripped away my need for external validation and broke open the quiet walls between me and my children. My silent sacrifices had never made me a victim, just as my children's past neglect had not made them irredeemable. Standing in that doorway, I made a silent, sacred promise to my family. We would continue to live in a home where worth was never conditional, where vulnerability was honored as strength, and where no one would ever have to carry their burdens alone in the dark. Stepping out onto the back porch in the cool, crisp autumn night air, I took a deep, peaceful breath, feeling a profound, radiant warmth fill my chest. Looking back at the long, agonizing road that had brought me to 36, from the heartbreaking loss of Thomas in Vancouver to the warm sanctuary of my home tonight, I knew with absolute certainty that my story was finally, completely mine. True family legacy is never something inherited through titles or preserved through artificial appearances. It is something earned through honesty, nurtured with unconditional love, and rebuilt with unyielding integrity. Healing doesn't begin when the world finally acknowledges your pain. It begins when you stop letting past grief define your future, lock the door on your ghosts, and step courageously into the beautiful life you build with your own hands. As the cool night breeze rustled through the crimson leaves above me, I held my children's hands tight, looked up at the starlit Seattle sky, and smiled, knowing that our family was finally, completely free.